Okay, hello everybody, and thank you for coming to the solar power class at Fruithaven, Ecovillage, fruithaven.org. So I'm going to talk about a number of things today relating to solar power systems. We've installed enough solar power systems here that kind of have a general understanding of them, so I think I'm qualified to speak on the subject. I'm going to talk about the basic elements of a solar power system, like what does it look like and what are the basic parts you have in them, and also average costs. I'll talk about basic safety principles, how to ensure that your system doesn't catch on fire or explode, because that's not good, and also lightning protection and stuff like that. I'm going to talk about pros and cons of different types of equipment, different types of panels, charge controllers, inverters, batteries, and all-in-one systems. And that's about it. So first, let's take a look at this image here on this piece of paper, which we can see is the basic diagram of a basic solar power system. All right? So, I'm not sure how close I have to hold it to the camera.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. So we can see here at the top there's the solar panels, right? And those are generally going to be on the roof, or you might have a separate rack to hold them. And the electricity from the solar panels that's generated from the sun goes down into the charge controller. And then the charge controller charges the batteries, right? Now, from the batteries, electricity in direct current or DC electricity goes into the inverter, which converts it to AC, 120 volts, or if you're in Europe, perhaps 230 volts, which is what's for house wiring and alternating current. And so then it shows here the electricity is going from the inverter into the breaker box of the house and then onto your household appliances. It also shows a generator, which is also hooked up to the inverter. And the reason for that is simply because some people have a backup generator with their solar system if they have to use, maybe if they have a small solar system and they want to use power tools. Or maybe it's been really cloudy for a week and their batteries are running low, they don't want to damage their batteries or run out of power, so they have a backup generator, and that inverter might have some inverters have an option for you to hook up a generator and it automatically switches. Other times, here for example, a lot of times we'll put an actual A-B switch because the inverter maybe doesn't have a generator hookup, so right before the breaker box, we'll put an A-B source selector switch. That basically it's a switch between electricity coming from the inverter, electricity coming from the generator. And of course, the other option is if you have grid tie-in, you could also have a grid tie-in option. So you could select between grid tie-in, inverter, and generator, although it's often nice if it's automatic. So these are the basic parts of solar systems. Every solar system is going to have these, with the exception of solar systems that don't have an inverter because they aren't powering AC stuff in a house, like no appliances. In that case, you'd be running 12-volt DC items. Like anything that you plug in that has a little black box that you plug into the wall, like your cell phone charger or your laptop adapter, that's always that's a transformer that goes from AC to DC. So it's more efficient to run things from DC. Like, for example, I have a DC adapter for my laptop, so I can plug it right into the solar batteries. I don't have to have it go to AC first. But there's most of these, like marine applications, like on boats, they might use more 12-volt DC for like the radios and the lights and stuff. So, but in most cases, you're going to be using an inverter hooked up to your house wiring. Sometimes the charge controller and the inverter are one unit. They're just together. So that's called like a hybrid inverter. And then sometimes the charge controller, the inverter, and the batteries are all together in one unit. Like I think the Tesla Powerwall is like that. So there's different types of combinations of these elements, but every system has every one of these elements. Does anybody have any questions about the basic parts of a solar system? Okay. Another thing to mention is the costs. So people here might be, this is different all over the world, so I'm just giving costs what we are generally paying here. So somebody might have a solar system that's somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 watts with 2 batteries, 100 amp hours, or 4 batteries, 400 amp hours at 12 volts, something like that. A small system that's basically enough to power charge a couple phones, a computer, a couple lights, and a blender once in a while, like the very basics. All the way up to like my system, which is a little bit bigger, and you can have, like, for example, a chest freezer or a fridge. A system like that is generally going to be between $1,500 and $4,000. I know that's a big range, but there's also a big range of capacities. When you get above $4,000, you start going into much bigger systems that can power multiple appliances and things like that. And there's also really tiny all-in-one systems that are just $500 or less. And those are like kind of for example, somebody who just wants to run like maybe a camera and a security light on a pole, and they'll put this tiny little all-in-one system, like a little solar panel and a little tiny inverter that's just enough to power that. And those are, so you can get really small solar systems that are basically just for running one really small thing in a remote area. Alright, so let's move on. If there's no questions about those things so far, let's move on to basic safety principles. So obviously you want to have fuses and circuit breakers in your system. For those of you who don't have much experience with electronics or electricity, fuses and circuit breakers, basically the circuit breakers, most times in your house there's like a gray metal box somewhere in the basement, or that has, you open it and there's a bunch of black switches that automatically turn off if there's a short. If there's a short in the electrical wiring, basically the positive and the negative, or the hot and the neutral are contacting, or there's the appliance is malfunction or something, and the electricity shorts, and it can cause sparks and it can cause a fire. So the job of the circuit breaker is supposed to detect when that's happening and flip off automatically. And the circuit breakers are just generally designed to turn off when the current hits a certain number of amps. Like in your house wiring, a 15 amp circuit breaker, if your dryer is broken and it starts to all of a sudden pull 50 amps because there's a short, or 200 amps, the circuit breaker is just going to flip off and it's going to prevent causing a fire. So that's something that goes right here, because you have no AC in your solar system. You have no alternating current in your solar system until after the inverter. So then it goes into a breaker box that's going to have a bunch of circuit breakers. But you still need fuses, by the way, were the precursor to circuit breakers. So a fuse is replaceable, so it's like a little tiny cylinder. This would be more like in your grandmother's house that was built in the 1950s. There might still be a fuse box. It's the basically the same concept. So you also, to have a really safe system, you also need a fuse or a circuit breaker in between the panels and the charge controller, and also after the batteries. And so basically this prevents, for example, if your charge controller malfunctions, what can happen is that the solar panels can charge the batteries fully, and once they're charging the batteries fully, the flow of current starts to go the other direction, right? So you don't want your batteries charging your solar panels, because then your solar panels would just be ruined very quickly. It'd just be totally destroyed. So normally the charge controller stops that. It ensures there's only a one-way, it's a controller, right? It ensures a one-way flow of electricity. Once the batteries are full, it cuts it off and it stops charging them, and it doesn't let current flow back into the panels. But bad things can happen, and you can just get a whole bunch of current going into your panels. So you have a circuit breaker here. It also helps prevent shorts. If the charge controller just starts melting, which if you have a cheap Chinese charge controller, one day it might just start melting, right? And that can cause problems. So you have a DC circuit breaker, which is different than an AC circuit breaker. So DC is direct current, AC is alternating current. Anything here with the batteries is all direct current. Anything after the inverter is alternating current that goes into your house wiring. So you're going to have a special type of circuit breaker, a DC circuit breaker here, and you're going to have one after the batteries. And the one after the batteries is obvious for the same reason. If there's a malfunction anywhere, it starts drawing a whole bunch of current, your batteries can get destroyed, the wires can get destroyed. Really the function of a circuit breaker is to protect the wires, because the wires can start melting, and the plastic can start melting, they can start smoking and melting, which can cause a fire. And to know what size breakers and fuses and stuff you need to do some basic calculations. It's very basic math that you need to make sure you know what you're doing, or have someone do that, because if you put the wrong size breaker, it's either going to turn off for no reason, or it's not going to actually protect your system when you need it. So very basic equation that you use to determine the size of the breaker between the panels and the charge controller, and between the batteries and everything else. And of course, knowing the AC breaker size to go to your house is very easy. AC breakers don't really come in that many, so it's all going to be like 10 amps, 15 amps, 20 amps. There's not much difference. But for the batteries and charge controller, there can be huge variations in the number of amps. Like one system might need a 125 amp breaker, another system might need a 300 amp breaker. So that's all about fuses and circuit breakers. Any questions?
That was a lot.
Yeah. And then I've gone a little bit too in depth, but another thing is a 120 volt AC dangers. So everyone knows that the house wiring is dangerous. It can cause fires if you stick a fork into the outlet, a big lightning bolt comes out and electrocutes you. So AC is generally considered to be more dangerous than DC. Now DC can also be very dangerous and can kill you, but the thing with solar systems is people often assume because it's 12 volts or 24 volts and it's batteries that they can't really hurt themselves much. But right after the inverter, it's all 120 volts AC, so you can electrocute yourself just as easily. The last thing I touch on in terms of safety is lightning protection, although I don't know very much about lightning protection. So I can't speak a lot on this subject, but I do know it's a good idea to have a ground rod. So generally we'll have the rails of the solar panels are mounted on. We'll do a nice thick cable running all the way down to the ground, and we'll hook it up to the copper ground rod. And that's important because it can actually, if there is a lightning bolt nearby, that some of it kind of strikes off onto your roof, and it's going to get sucked down into the ground by that lightning rod rather than destroying your solar panel. Now, if you get a lightning bolt that strikes directly on your solar panels, there's probably nothing that you can do unless you spend thousands of dollars on lightning protection and have like a massive rod above the house. But at least it can help. In terms of the safety of the system itself and grounding, it's more important to have the ground wire of like your AC wiring connected to the inverter. That's more important than having it connected to the ground. Of course, you should have it connected to the ground as well, but that's not what protects you from shorts in the system. For those of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, there's a dog visiting us. For those of you who have literally no idea what I've been talking about for the past few minutes, if you look at a AC house plug outlet, there's 3 holes. There's 2 slits and 1 hole. And the 2 slits are hot and neutral electricity, and the hole is ground. And that's what protects you. That's where the current's supposed to get sucked through if there's a short. And that has to be connected to the source of the electricity. It's more important that it's connected to the source than it's connected to the ground, even though it's called the ground, right? So you need to make sure that your AC wiring is installed correctly, not by a sloppy electrician who just connects the hot and the neutral. And in terms of lightning, then ideally that should all be connected to the ground, including the rails the solar panels are mounted on. Any questions? Great. Now we're going to get into some slightly less technical stuff.
We have a question regarding,
yes.
So if, is it possible to connect directly to the charge controller to draw power, like charge something directly from the solar panels or something like that?
The charge controller does often have a 12-volt DC terminal on it that you can hook low amperage things on it. You can't hook your inverter straight up to that because it's not rated for that. But there's small things that you can hook up to that as long as it's 12 volts.
Oh.
Yeah.
Like sometimes you can charge your phone or something?
A lot of times the charge controller will actually have a USB port. We have a number of ones here that there's actually a USB port on the charge controller. You can plug your phone right into that. Because it's 12 volt, they figured it's cheap to throw that in. It's a good feature. So yeah, but you don't want to put anything big on your charge controller DC terminals. So onto panels, charge controllers, inverters, the basics of what types of those things you want, right? So there's 2 main types of panels. There's polycrystalline and there's monocrystalline. Polycrystalline panels are going to last 20 to 35 years, hopefully, and then the monocrystalline panels will last 25 to 40 years, hopefully. Now, those are assuming the ratings of the manufacturer are accurate, and also depends on your climate and how strong the UV rays are and stuff like that. So monocrystalline is a bit higher quality and more expensive. There is not a lot more expensive, but it's considered to be a little bit more efficient, a little bit longer lasting, and more expensive. So it's generally better to get monocrystalline panels. I think that polycrystalline panels are blue and monocrystalline are black, but I don't remember. It could have that reversed. But there is a color difference. That's the important thing. So that's all. Panels do have plenty of different ratings, like different number of watts. You might have panels that are 150 watts or 400 watts. They'll be 12 volts or 24 volts, but that's just things that will depend on your system. Any questions about panels? So, charge controllers.
Oh wait, I do have. So
Yeah.
can you have a panel different sizes and they can all hook up together? Say like 150 watt and 200, 300. Like you can
No.
have different sizes.
There's rules about that. Like there's certain ways you can do it. Like if you have, say you have 2 150 watt panels and 2 300 watt panels, and supposedly there's a way you can like wire 2 of them in series and 2 of them in parallel or do something like that to increase the efficiency. But generally it's going to be the most efficient if you have them all equal panels wired together. And obviously same thing with batteries too. And then on to charge controllers. Were there any more questions about panels? No. Okay. So the charge controller, as I said before, the solar panel puts its electricity into the charge controller, which is in charge of deciding how much voltage to get to the batteries to keep them charged, right? And there's 2 main types of charge controller. There's PWM and there's MPPT. There's no reason to buy a PWM charge controller unless you're really cheap, because you maybe can find them cheaper. But MPPT is a newer technology. It's more efficient. Also, MPPT is more likely to, it can automatically switch between 12 and 24 volts, for example, depending on your system and your wiring, whereas the PWM is just going to be wired for one, so it's less versatile. So MPPT is better. Don't ever buy a PWM charge controller unless you're trying to make like the cheapest solar system ever. As for inverter, so the inverter, as we mentioned in the diagram, it takes the 12 volt or 24 volt or 36 or 48 volt DC from the batteries, low voltage DC, and converts it to high voltage AC, alternating current, which is a different type of electricity traveling. And that's what allows you to hook it up to appliances and devices and anything that has a normal household plug, like your cell phone charger and stuff like that. So there's different types of inverters, but generally we're thinking about pure sine wave versus modified sine wave. A pure sine wave inverter basically outputs its electricity. The form of the wave of electricity is a pure sine wave, ideally with no aberrations. A modified sine wave inverter might be a bit more choppy or funny, and it's going to have more like dirty electricity basically. So a modified sine wave inverter is fine if you're trying to make a cheap system that's going to run stuff that's not that consequential. Like for example, if you're running a security light in the middle of nowhere in a little tiny system, you might buy a PWM charge controller and a modified sine wave inverter. Or in your car, like the people often have a cheap inverter in their car that's just for running basic things like the air compressor if they need to inflate their tires or whatever, and a few accessories, and that's often modified sine wave. But for your house, it's usually better to have pure sine wave. And pure sine wave is better because it's less likely to damage electronics. The pure sine wave is cleaner electricity, basically. And yeah, it's better for electronics, for computers, for charging cell phones, that kind of thing. So generally you're going to want a pure sine wave controller, inverter, even though they're a bit more expensive. Another thing that's important about inverters, the primary rating that's going to tell you how much stuff you can run on it is in watts. And some of the manufacturers are a bit dishonest about it. Like there's the continuous rating and the peak rating. So you can have an inverter that's 1500 watts. That could mean that it continuously runs at 1500 watts, which by the way is about how much a Vitamix runs when you first turn it on. So you could that could mean it continuously runs at 1500 watts, or it could mean the peak, and the peak is usually twice the continuous rating. So basically you can buy an inverter that says 1500 watts, and it could actually be 750 watt continuous, which is nothing. That's not enough to run a Vitamix. And its peak is 1500 watts, so for the first second when you turn on an appliance, it can handle that jump at first, but then its continuous rating is only going to run at 750 watts, or a bit more than that. And if you run it higher, it'll burn out or turn off. So it's important if you're buying an inverter to check out the rating in watts and make sure you know whether it's continuous or peak, because some manufacturers will be like, this is a 2000 watt inverter, and then later you find out it's actually 1000 watt continuous, 2000 watt peak. But otherwise they're mostly honest. It'll say 30, like my inverter is a 3500 watt inverter at 7000 watt peak, right? So it's usually about double. There are some inverters, like the Victron inverters are usually, the number is given in volt amps, which is similar to watts, but you can kind of treat it as the same number. Yeah, and you just have to kind of look at all the things you're going to run and figure out how many watts you're going to need. That's all it is, really. So, any question about inverters so far? Okay, and as I mentioned before, the charge controllers and the inverters are sometimes combined into one unit.
The one thing about there's different, the 24 volt and 12 and
yeah,
48 even, I think, right?
Yeah. Now we start to get into like complicated electrical theory stuff, but basically that is kind of important because the bigger your inverter, the higher you're going to want your battery voltage because it's more efficient. So if you have a 6,000 watt inverter, which is enough to run a very large like serious power tools and all kinds of stuff, you don't want to be running 12 volt batteries on your solar system, because let's do like a quick, remember I said there's a lot, like some very simple math you can use to calculate these things. I'm going to go open up my calculator and I'm going to type 6,000, which is the watts, divided by 12. So 6,000 watts divided by 12 volts, that's 500 amps. So you're pulling 500 amps through your battery wire, and that is a ridiculous number of amps. That's insane, right? You're going to have to use like copper cables this thick to pull that amount of electricity without it melting the wires. And it's more dangerous. Your connections need to be really good to handle that that amperage. And if you screw up on any one little thing, it's going to be disastrous. So in that case, it'd be better to have, you can wire 4 12-volt batteries in parallel, in series, and then you could have a 48-volt system instead. So you have your 4 12-volt batteries, you wire them together in series instead of parallel, and now they're 48 volts. So let's do 6,000 watts divided by 48. Now you're only pulling 125 amps through your wires, which is still a lot, but it's something that's a bit more manageable. On the other hand, if you have a 2,000 watt solar system, let's divide that by 12, you're pulling 166 amps, which is still something a bit more reasonable, but if you have your 2,000 watt system at 24 volts, 2,000 divided by 24, now you're only pulling 83 amps through your wires, which is much better. So for smaller systems, it's okay to have 12 volts, but the bigger your system is, you're going to want to go to 36 volts or 48 volts for your batteries. So
what would you say the max, like for 12 volt? I think I have a 3,000 amp.
Yeah, I mean,
or
that's
3,000 watts, sorry, 3,000 watts.
Well, you have a 3,000 watt inverter, and you
12.
have 12 volt batteries. Yeah, that's similar to what I have. Yeah, and that's still something that's manageable, but I did that mainly because I wanted to run a lot of 12 volt things off of the batteries directly without having to use a transformer. So that's 250 amps. So you can get a 300 amp circuit breaker for the batteries, and that's fine. That's still a lot, but as long as you have thick cables, as long as your cables are thick enough to handle that and your connections are well done, it'll be fine. But it's going to be a little bit more efficient to have 24 volts. But they still sell 3,000 watt 12 volt inverters, so obviously it's still acceptable. There's nothing wrong with doing that. It can get ridiculous if you have a really big inverter at 12 volts, but yeah. Any more questions about inverters before I talk about batteries? Okay, there are several different types of batteries that are used for solar systems. Right? There's 2 different types of lead-acid batteries mainly. Then there's lithium iron phosphate batteries, also commonly referred to as Li-ion or lithium-ion batteries. And those are also referred to as LiFePoE4, which is like a weird acronym for them. And then there's nickel-iron batteries. So let's quickly run through each of them. Lead acid is traditionally used for car batteries. It's probably the most widely used type of big battery, marine deep cycle batteries, stuff like that. They're all lead acid. And there's really 3 types. There's flooded lead acid, which are the kind where you have those little things on the top. You have to pull out the plugs and put distilled water in it every once in a while to top it off. And then there's sealed lead acid, of which there are 2 types, AGM and gel. So gel is the best of the sealed types. Gel is better, has a bit more performance in warmer weather than AGM sealed. And sealed AGM or gel is better than flooded. If you were confused by all that, basically just gel lead acid batteries are the best of the lead acid types. And then there's lithium iron phosphate batteries, which have a big fan following, and they do have a longer lifespan than lead acid batteries. And people will do like kind of cost analyses and kind of figure, okay, well, if the lead acid battery is going to last 5 years and the lithium ion battery is going to last 15 years, then you divide the price by the number of years they'll last. Oh, the lithium ion battery is actually cheaper. However, your lithium ion battery might just randomly catch on fire in 8 years, and then, and there are lead acid batteries that last 10 years, that last 5 years. I've seen some sites on the internet that seem like desperately defending Li-ion batteries, and they're like, lead acid batteries have a lifespan of only 2 to 3 years in your solar system. Li-ion batteries will last 15 to 20 years. And you see all these news stories about Tesla Li-ion batteries randomly catching on fire and killing the driver while they're trapped inside. So I'm not so quick to say Li-ion is better than lead acid. I think that there are reasons to have lead acid, and Li-ion is great. But I'm not sold that Li-ion is automatically the better technology. It's definitely more difficult to dispose of and a lot more toxic if you have a battery fire to have Li-ion versus lead acid. They're both very toxic, by the way, and very polluting, of course. So you want the battery to last as long as possible. So if you have lots of money, you could actually get a nickel-iron battery, which is like the original Edison battery. The first electric car ever ran on a nickel-iron battery. Nickel-iron batteries are pretty much not toxic at all compared to lead acid and Li-ion batteries. They're a lot heavier, which is why they're not so good to use in electric cars, but in your house they're just permanently sitting there. It doesn't matter how heavy they are. They're big and heavy, but they can last 30, 50, up to 100 years. There are nickel-iron batteries that have been operational for 100 years. Their rated lifespan is something like 30 years. The manufacturers don't say more than that because they don't want to get ridiculous, but they can last way longer than 30 years. They require a little bit of maintenance. You have to top up the liquid in them with something fairly benign. I don't remember exactly what, but yeah, not any serious chemical or anything. I wish I could remember right now. But anyway, so nickel iron batteries are not used often in solar systems because you need a bit more specialized knowledge to be able to use them. You need a charge controller and an inverter that have modifiable parameters. So they're automatically programmed, usually these charge controllers and inverters, to function with lead acid or Li-ion batteries. So they have, like, for example, low voltage cutoff, high voltage cutoff, different charging parameters, what to do when the voltage is this point, what to do when the voltage is this point. So Li-ion batteries, nickel iron batteries are different, and they don't program them for that because very few people use them. And you have to be able to kind of program those parameters. But if you do, you're going to have solar batteries that last 80 years, and that's amazing. So I think a lot more people should use nickel iron batteries in their solar system. However, they are a lot more expensive than the initial cost is a lot more expensive than the other battery types. However, in the long run, they end up being much less expensive. So, if you have a solar system and the doomsday apocalypse comes and your batteries stop working in 4 years, you have nothing. All right, any questions about batteries? Okay, great. Hopefully I can encourage some people to try out nickel iron batteries in their solar systems.
But you need specialized controller for that?
You need to, well, not specialized, you just need to have one that you can program. So a lot of them you can hook up a USB cable and program the parameters. Oh, okay. So you have to know a bit more, but then you got a battery that lasts many, many, many years.
And they sell those in Ecuador?
Nope, but they can be imported. Oh yeah, a little bit more about batteries, and you want to have your batteries stored on something that's not a cement floor, because if they're stored on a cement floor, there's some kind of like induction thing that happens where it just kind of sucks the energy out of the battery. So if you have a cement floor, you should put a block of wood or plastic or something, or a metal frame or something, so the batteries are on something, not directly on the cement. And aside from that, I've seen ridiculous things. First of all, people just forgetting that their batteries can't go below a certain voltage, and their batteries get permanently damaged, especially lead acid. It can happen to Li-ion, but it's more likely to happen to lead acid batteries because they're less forgiving if you discharge them. So they get below 11.9 volts, which is less than a 50% charge state, and they're automatically permanently damaged. You basically just cut a year off their lifespan. So hopefully you charge it up again quickly, and think of the inside of a battery as like a balloon, and you got to keep it charged, and if it gets too low, it loses flexibility over time. But anyways, so I've seen that, people forgetting that their battery shouldn't go below, or if it's a 24 volt system, it can't get below, I think it's 23.9 or something, and usually it spends its time above that voltage. But then I've seen people storing clothes on top of their batteries. I saw a nice brand new $1,000 solar battery bank with just a big pile of clothes right on top of all the batteries. That could short out the terminals, like they're just right on the terminals, this big pile of clothes, and that could have started a house fire and destroyed this person's newly built house. People don't, so you have to have kind of basic literacy and electrical safety to have an open solar system in the middle of your house. It's better to build a cabinet around it or something. That's enough about batteries. A little bit about all-in-one systems. There's various types of all-in-one systems. So there's all-in-one, there's hybrid inverters that have both the inverter and the charge controller. And then there's something like the Tesla Powerwall, which is going to have everything in one box, which is the inverter, the charge controller, and the battery. The pros of this is that it's simply easy. It's just one unit that's installed. However, with a system that's multiple different components rather than all in one, it can be easier to switch out components that fail or service them. Like if just your charge controller breaks, you can just buy a new charge controller and put it in, or you can have another one waiting. But if you have a hybrid inverter that has the charge controller and the inverter, you have to open it up and look at which module is the charge controller, and maybe it's not replaceable, and it's a bit more complicated. I've always preferred the different components, or I guess a hybrid charge controller inverter is good, because I guess you can just replace the whole unit if something breaks, which is kind of a waste. But I definitely would not want something like the Tesla Powerwall that's everything all in one because, yeah, they probably sell parts and things like that, but it has to all go through them. I can't just buy any old inverter and stick it in or any old charge controller and stick it in if that part of the unit fails. Whereas I can do that if I bought everything separately. So, yeah, that's all I got so far. Any questions?
What do you think of those, I guess they call them like generator kind of, but it's more like mobile power, like instead of a gasoline power, it's just battery. I guess the inverter is already inside it.
It's just designed to be portable, that's all. Like they call them a solar generator, and it's just an all-in-one solar system. So I guess that would fall into the category of an all-in-one system that has the inverter. It's basically a pre-built solar system that you're going to plug in your panels, and that's it. That's easy. That's great for somebody who doesn't want to think about most of this stuff and just buy something that's already together. Then that's great.
Could be good for projects instead of using gasoline ones. I don't know.
Yeah, but unless it has a lot of batteries, it's not going to be. If it has a lot of enough batteries for like a construction project, then it's not going to be portable anymore.
Yeah.
Because the amount of batteries you need to be able to support running power tools all day, it's a crazy amount of batteries. So it would no longer be portable. I think it's more for like running like music and light shows and speakers and stuff at events like that, because they can handle that kind of power draw generally, or like radios and lights and things like that, but nothing major. But yeah, those can be very useful for basic things. That's all I have. Any last questions?
Bob knows a lot about.
I've got no questions.
Okay.
All right. So thank you all for attending the solar power class. Hope you all learned something or two.
Say something about the.
You can press the stop button now.
Okay. Check out the website.